This is Bone Chillers to disturb your dreams. Dare to join us? Click subscribe, ring the bell. But remember, we cannot guarantee your safety from the nightmares that await. Prepare to be thrilled, chilled, and filled with a sense of dread you'll find nowhere else. Welcome to the darkness. We've been waiting.
The Farmhouse Murders. The sun hung low in the Texas sky, casting long shadows across the empty road as the van kicked up dust on its way to the secluded farmhouse. The air was heavy with heat, cicadas buzzing loud enough to drown out the old rock and roll crackling from the radio. Wayne Thompson, leaning over the steering wheel, squinted through the windshield. His white cowboy hat was stained with sweat, a permanent grin etched on his weathered face. "Almost there, y'all," Wayne called out, turning to the passengers crammed in the back. Maxine Minx, young and hungry for the world, smirked from the front seat, her red lips glistening in the fading light. In the back, Bobby Lynn, with her sun-bleached hair and tight denim shorts, shared a conspiratorial smile with Jackson, the group's cameraman and her not-so-secret lover. Next to them, RJ, the director, nervously fiddled with the camera equipment, while Lorraine, his quiet girlfriend, sat hunched with arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable with the entire endeavour. "Just keep your panties on, RJ," Bobby Lynn teased, throwing him a wink. "Ain't nothing wrong with a little bit of fun." "This is art," RJ muttered, adjusting his glasses. "Not smut." Maxine leaned back, brushing her fingers through her hair. "Long as it pays the bills, it don't matter what you call it." Wayne turned off the main road, steering the van down a rutted dirt path that wound through fields of tall grass. The farmhouse finally came into view, a worn-down relic from another time, standing alone against the setting sun like a spectre from a forgotten era. They all fell silent as they approached. The farmhouse loomed, its peeling paint and crooked shutters like a grimace in the dimming light. A barn sat nearby, its doors hanging slightly ajar, the darkness within beckoning like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. "This is the place?" Lorraine whispered, her voice barely audible over the van's sputtering engine. Wayne gave her a wink. "Yep, just got to square things away with the old folks. Then we got ourselves the perfect set." The group was met by Howard, a hunched skeletal figure who shuffled forward from the shadows of the porch. His eyes were milky, clouded with age, yet something about the way he looked at them made Maxine's skin crawl. Anna, his wife, appeared behind him, her face hidden beneath a frayed sun hat, her wrinkled hands gripping the porch railing with unnerving strength. Wayne, ever the smooth talker, stepped forward with his most charming smile. "Howdy, sir, ma'am. Appreciate you letting us use your property for our little project." And Howard's lips pulled back in something that might have been a smile but looked more like a snarl. "As long as you stay out of our way," he croaked. "My wife ain't one for company." "Don't worry, old-timer," Jackson called out, throwing an arm around Bobby Lynn. "We'll be gone before you know it." Anna's gaze lingered on Maxine, her eyes narrowing with something dark and hungry. Maxine shivered, brushing it off. They were here for a job, after all, a job that would, hopefully, make them all a lot of money. Ortega. Night fell quickly over the farmhouse, and under the dim glow of a portable lamp, the group got to work. The barn, with its cobweb-covered beams and musky scent, made the perfect set for their film. Maxine, the star of the show, was all sultry confidence as RJ barked orders and adjusted the lighting. Lorraine hovered nervously in the background, her discomfort growing with every suggestive scene. While Jackson filmed Bobby Lynn and Maxine, Wayne slipped outside for a smoke, the cool night air a welcome break from the thick tension inside. He wandered towards the edge of the property, taking a piss behind a cluster of trees. The sound of rustling leaves made him pause. "Hello?" he called, turning his head. Silence greeted him, but the darkness between the trees seemed to pulse, alive with unseen eyes. Wayne laughed nervously and zipped up, turning back toward the barn, only to freeze. Anna was standing in the shadows, her face half hidden by the night. She was naked, her pale, wrinkled skin glowing under the moonlight like some grotesque statue. Wayne's smile faltered. "Ma'am, you all right?" Anna didn't answer. Instead, she took a step forward, eyes locked on his, her thin lips curling into a twisted grin. Before Wayne could react, something cold and sharp pierced his stomach. He gasped, looking down to see the handle of a pitchfork jutting out from his belly. The world spun, his knees buckled, and he crumpled to the ground, staring up at the stars as his life drained away. Inside the barn, the atmosphere shifted as the air grew colder, and the sounds outside became an unsettling background noise. Lorraine had stepped out to get some air, but had yet to return. RJ, too caught up in his artistic vision, ignored her absence until a scream cut through the air, shrill and desperate. "Lorraine!" RJ shouted, dropping the camera. The others stopped what they were doing, the playful mood evaporating in an instant. Maxine, already half-dressed, grabbed a flashlight and followed RJ outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing Lorraine standing at the edge of the field, her eyes wide with terror. They're killing him!" she stammered, pointing toward the barn. And Jackson and Bobby Lynn rushed over, but all they found was Wayne's cowboy hat, soaked in blood. The reality of their situation settled in like ice water down their spines. As the night descended into chaos, Howard and Anna moved like shadows through the darkened farmhouse, their frail appearances belying a monstrous strength. Jackson, attempting to make a break for the van, was ambushed by Howard wielding a rusty axe. The blow was swift and brutal, leaving Jackson twitching on the ground, his blood pooling in the dirt. Bobby Lynn ran screaming through the cornfields, her breath ragged, her limbs tangled in the tall stalks. But Anna was relentless, her eyes gleaming with an insane light. The last thing Bobby Lynn saw was Anna's gnarled face grinning down at her, before a sickening crunch ended her screams. Back in the barn, Maxine and Lorraine barricaded themselves inside, hearts pounding in their chests. The sounds of Howard's heavy footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the scrape of metal dragging across the ground. "Please," Lorraine whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "We have to get out of here." Maxine's eyes were wild, but she wasn't about to give up. "No way in hell I'm dying in this dump." Aye. As Howard broke through the door, Maxine grabbed a heavy wrench and swung with all her might, connecting with his skull. He staggered, blood spraying from the wound, but a sick grin remained plastered on his face. Maxine and Lorraine took their chance, bolting for the fields. The night was alive with the sounds of pursuit, Anna's cackling laughter echoing through the darkness. They reached the van, only to find the keys missing and Jackson's lifeless body slumped against the steering wheel. Maxine turned to Lorraine, her eyes hard. "We fight or we die." The final confrontation came in a blaze of blood and violence in the old farmhouse's kitchen. Maxine, fueled by sheer desperation, fought Anna with a kitchen knife, while Lorraine struggled to fend off Howard's gnarled hands. The old couple, driven by a mad hunger, seemed almost unstoppable. But in the end, Maxine buried her knife deep into Anna's throat, the old woman collapsing in a gurgling mess. Howard, seeing his wife's lifeless form, let out an anguished wail before succumbing to Lorraine's frantic blows with a heavy iron skillet. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the two survivors. As dawn broke over the horizon, Maxine and Lorraine, bloodied and bruised, limped away from the nightmare that had unfolded on the desolate farm. The sun's first light revealed the extent of the carnage behind them, a macabre scene of twisted bodies and spilled blood. The farmhouse, once a place of quiet decay, now stood as a testament to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. The Hallowed Veil. Rain pattered against the windows as Claire stood in the doorway of her empty home. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the lake beyond the yard stretched out like an ink-stained blot beneath the overcast sky. It had been 3 months since her husband, Mark, was found dead by that very lake. He had been floating face down in the water, his expression strangely serene. The police called it suicide, but they could never explain why. Claire never believed it, she refused to. Mark had been everything to her, the kind of man who seemed to glow with life. The idea that he would willingly drown himself seemed absurd. Yet, here she was, standing in their once-shared home, surrounded by memories that no longer fit. She closed the door behind her, the sound of the latch clicking shut, reverberating through the empty halls. The house felt different now, colder, as if the walls themselves had lost their warmth after Mark's death. She set her suitcase down and took a deep breath, trying to ground herself. This was her first time back since the funeral, and already she could feel the weight of the house pressing against her. As Claire moved through the dimly lit rooms, flicking on lights to chase away the shadows, she noticed something odd. The air was colder near the master bedroom, a chill that clung to her skin and made her shiver. She tried to shake it off as paranoia, a trick of grief and exhaustion. But something was wrong. She could feel it deep in her bones. The feeling only intensified that night as she lay in bed. She had turned off all the lights, but there was still a faint, unnatural glow in the room, something like moonlight, yet sharper, more metallic. She turned on her side, clutching Mark's pillow, trying to find comfort in the lingering scent of him. But sleep evaded her. Instead, she lay there, listening to the silence, until she heard it. A creak, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking down the hallway. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She sat up, straining her ears, but the sound stopped as soon as she moved. She told herself it was just the old house settling, but doubt gnawed at her. The sound had been too precise, too purposeful. It wasn't until the third night that she dared to investigate. And Claire stood in the hallway, her feet bare against the cold hardwood floor. The house was silent, save for the occasional groan of the wooden beams. She was about to turn back to her room when a faint rustle drew her attention. It was coming from Mark's study, the room he had kept locked for years. She had always respected his privacy, never pressing him about what he did in there. But now, in his absence, the secrets of that room seemed to beckon her. Her fingers trembled as she turned the doorknob. To her surprise, it was unlocked. The air inside the study was heavy, stale, as if it hadn't been touched in months. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight. The room was cluttered with stacks of old books, scattered papers, and strange trinkets that looked ancient and foreign. But what caught her attention was a large, leather-bound journal resting on Mark's desk. Claire hesitated, a part of her screaming that she shouldn't pry, that some things were better left undiscovered. But she was driven by a need she couldn't quite explain, a need to understand what had truly happened to Mark. She opened the journal, flipping through pages filled with erratic handwriting. The entries were disturbing. Mark had written about dreams, vivid, horrifying dreams of a figure that watched him from the lake. He described waking up in strange places, covered in mud and water with no memory of how he got there. The dreams had started a year ago, growing more intense, more real, until he began to question whether they were dreams at all. The last entry was dated the night before his death. The presence is no longer content with watching. It wants more. Tonight, I will confront it. If I fail, it will come for her next. Her blood ran cold. What had Mark been trying to protect her from? That night, Claire was jolted awake by a loud crash. The house shook as if something massive had slammed into it. She grabbed her flashlight and rushed downstairs, her heart hammering in her chest. The front door was wide open, rain slashing in through the gap. She stepped outside into the downpour, the cold biting into her skin. The lake was eerily still, the surface reflecting the stormy sky like a dark mirror. But as she turned to go back inside, she caught a glimpse of something at the water's edge. A figure stood there, tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the rain. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly turned its head toward her. For a moment, she thought it was Mark, but as the lightning flashed, she realized it was something else entirely. Its eyes glowed an unnatural, sickly yellow, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. She stumbled back, slamming the door shut, her mind reeling. Was this the presence Mark had written about? Had it driven him to his death? And now, was it coming for her? The rest of the night passed in a haze of terror. Claire heard footsteps echoing through the halls, whispers that seemed to come from inside her own skull. She tried to hide in her bedroom, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. "Come to me." By dawn, Claire was a wreck. Her eyes were sunken, her hands trembling. She knew she couldn't stay in the house, but something was drawing her back to the lake. She felt as if invisible strings were pulling her, leading her toward the water where Mark had taken his final breath. The sun was just beginning to rise as Claire reached the shore. The lake was unnaturally calm, the surface like polished obsidian. As she stood there, the whispers returned, a chorus of voices overlapping in her mind. "You are the key, finish what he could not." The water began to ripple, small waves lapping at her feet. Something was rising from the depths. Claire watched in horror as the figure emerged, its shape becoming clearer with each step. It was Mark, or at least it looked like him. But his eyes were empty, lifeless, the same sickly yellow glow she had seen before. "Claire." It spoke, but the voice was wrong, distorted, like a recording played backward. "You shouldn't have come back." She wanted to run, but her feet were rooted to the ground. The thing that wore her husband's face moved closer, its grin widening. "He tried to stop me, but he was weak. You will be stronger. You will take his place." "No!" she screamed, but the words felt hollow, powerless. The thing reached out, its cold fingers brushing her cheek, and suddenly, the world went dark. When Claire awoke, she was lying on the shore, soaked and shivering. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent. She couldn't remember how she had gotten there, but the taste of brine lingered on her lips, and her hands were caked with mud. As she stumbled back toward the house, she realized something had changed. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was as if the house, the lake, and everything around her was holding its breath, waiting. She reached for the front door only to find it locked. But when she glanced at the window, she saw him, Mark's reflection smiling back at her from the glass, and she knew she would never leave.
The Gilded Glare, the first night Eva dreamed in colour. She lay in the cramped bed of her new apartment, the neon lights of the city outside her window flickering in through the worn-out curtains. It was her first night in Camden, London. Fresh from a small village in Yorkshire, she'd come to the city to study fashion at goldsmiths. The pulse of the city had always been a distant fantasy, a place where dreams came to life. But now, amidst the hum of traffic and the dim glow of streetlights, that fantasy felt like a shadow of itself. Eva tried to calm her nerves and drifted into an uneasy sleep, and that's when the dream began. In her dream, she found herself standing at the entrance of a grand ballroom. The air was rich with laughter, perfume, and the clinking of champagne glasses. The women wore elegant gowns that sparkled under golden chandeliers, and men in sharp suits danced with them to the swinging rhythms of a live jazz band. The year was 1965. She somehow knew this with a clarity that defied reason. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and excitement, the kind that makes you forget the outside world. Then she saw her, a stunning woman in a sequined dress that hugged her figure like it was painted on. Her hair was a cascade of dark curls, her lips painted a deep crimson. The crowd seemed to part for her as if she commanded the very space she occupied. Her laughter, melodic yet tinged with something darker, pulled Eva forward like a moth to a flame. "Isn't she divine?" a voice whispered beside Eva. She turned to find an older man with a twisted grin, but before she could respond, the dream shifted. The lights dimmed. The music warped into something discordant, and the glamorous faces around her blurred into grotesque masks of teeth and eyes. The woman, still radiant and unbothered, locked eyes with Eva before vanishing into the crimson shadows that had overtaken the room. Eva woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The following day, the dream clung to her mind like a stubborn stain. In class, she could barely focus. The images of that glamorous woman haunted her every thought. Who was she? And why did it feel so real? Determined to shake it off, Eva decided to explore the city that night. London was alive, pulsing with energy. The streets glowed with neon lights and the distant echoes of laughter. She wandered aimlessly until she found herself in front of an old nightclub, its faded sign barely readable under the dim street lamp. The Gilded Glare, it read. The name sent a shiver down her spine. It was the same club from her dream. Drawn by an unseen force, she stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and the faint echoes of forgotten music. The club was abandoned, a hollow shell of what it once was. Dust coated the dance floor, and the once plush booths were now tattered and moth-eaten. But as Eva walked deeper into the club, the air seemed to shimmer. Suddenly, it was as if a veil had been lifted. The club was alive again. The room was filled with laughter and music, just like in her dream. The crowd danced with wild abandon, their faces a blur. And there she was, the woman in the sequined dress, her eyes locking onto Eva's with a knowing smile. "Come," the woman beckoned, her voice cutting through the din like a knife. Eva's legs moved on their own. She followed the woman through a set of doors into a dimly lit corridor. The sounds of the party faded behind her, replaced by the slow drip of water and the faint hum of electricity. The woman led her deeper into the building, her figure swaying like a ghost in the darkness. And then they were alone in a small mirrored room. "What's your name?" Eva whispered, but the woman only smiled, her eyes glinting with a predatory gleam. Suddenly, the mirrors came to life, reflecting not just Eva and the mysterious woman, but shadowy figures that writhed and twisted in agony. The walls pulsed, the reflections contorting as if trying to break free from the glass. The woman's face shifted, her eyes turned hollow, her smile widening unnaturally. Eva screamed and bolted, crashing through the doors and out into the cold London night. As she stumbled onto the street, the club behind her flickered and faded back into its derelict state. The dreams returned, more vivid and more terrifying each night. In them, Eva became the woman's companion, moving through the city's hidden haunts and forgotten dance floors. She learned the woman's name was Vivienne, and that she had been the darling of the London nightlife scene in the 1960s, but as the dreams progressed, they began to unravel. The glamorous parties turned sinister, the guests' faces warping into monstrous grins. Vivienne's laughter became a shrill cackle, her touch like ice on Eva's skin, and the nightclub, the Gilded Glare, transformed into a labyrinth of blood-soaked walls and echoing screams. Eva would wake up each night with the taste of ash in her mouth and bruises she couldn't explain. Desperate for answers, Eva scoured old archives and records. She discovered that Vivienne had been a rising star in the 60s, known for her beauty and charm. But one night, she vanished without a trace. The last place she was seen alive was the Gilded Glare. Rumors whispered that she had made a pact with something dark, something that demanded more than just her soul. Eva realized with mounting dread that whatever pact Vivienne had made, it hadn't been fulfilled. The woman was still searching for a replacement, someone to take her place, and Vivienne had chosen her. The final night, the dream bled into reality. Eva found herself back in the Gilded Glare, but this time she couldn't wake up. The guests were no longer blurred figures. They were twisted, decayed corpses that danced and spun with grotesque glee. Vivienne stood at the center of the room, her once beautiful face a mask of rot and decay. "It's your turn, darling," Vivienne whispered, her voice like nails on glass. "You wanted the glamour, didn't you? The life of the city, the lights, the fame. It's all yours now." Eva tried to run, but the walls of the club closed in, the mirrors surrounding her. She was trapped, her reflection multiplying into infinite versions of herself, each one screaming silently. Vivian's laughter filled the room, growing louder and louder until it was all Eva could hear. As the mirrors shattered, reality itself seemed to collapse. Eva's body twisted and warped, her screams joining the cacophony of souls trapped within the club. She could feel herself dissolving, her essence being consumed by the darkness that Vivian had left behind. Days later, the apartment in Camden was rented out to a new tenant. Eva's belongings had been neatly packed away, her whereabouts unknown. In the Gilded Glare, the club that no one remembered existed, a new woman danced among the phantoms, her eyes wide with terror beneath the glittering mask she was now forced to wear. The city outside carried on, indifferent to the screams trapped within the club's forgotten walls.
London had claimed another soul. The Crimson Yearning. The creaking boards of the farmhouse were alive with a chorus of groans and whispers as the autumn wind howled through the broken shutters. The wooden beams, tired and bent under years of isolation, sang with a kind of loneliness that mirrored Pearl's own heart. She stood at the window, her eyes tracing the horizon where the sun had just begun to die, painting the sky a deep, vibrant crimson. This time she was certain would be different. Today was the day she would be seen. She ran her fingers along the frayed lace of her dress, worn thin from years of washing and mending. It was the best she had. Her mother's old Sunday best, stiff with age and stained with memories. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a young woman with wild, hopeful eyes, her pale face made gaunt from long days of toil and nights filled with restless dreams. Pearl's mother, Ruth, sat hunched by the hearth, her back rigid, her hands moving methodically as she kneaded dough. The harsh glow from the fire cast her face in sharp, unforgiving relief, revealing every crease and furrow etched into her skin. Her gaze never left the dough, as if it held the secrets to surviving another cold winter. "What are you standing there for?" Ruth's voice was a rasp, like dried leaves crunching underfoot. "Get back to your chores." "But Mama, today's the day." Pearl's voice trembled with a fragile excitement. She had seen the poster tacked to the town notice board weeks ago. A travelling troupe was holding auditions in town. They were looking for someone special, someone with talent. It was her chance to escape this prison of dirt and silence, to become something more than a farmer's daughter. Ruth's eyes shot up, sharp as broken glass. "Dreams don't fill bellies, girl. You think the world outside is kinder than here." Her words cut like a blade. "All that's waiting for you out there is disappointment." Pearl's heart sank, but a flicker of defiance lit in her eyes. She would prove her wrong. She had to. Today she would be discovered. As soon as the dough was shaped into loaves and tucked into the oven, Pearl slipped away to the barn, her only sanctuary. The air inside was thick with the smell of hay, damp earth, and animal musk. Her fingers trailed along the weathered wood of the stalls, her mind filled with visions of applause, of glittering lights and adoring fans. Her hands curled into fists. She would not die in this place, buried beneath the weight of her mother's bitterness. She deserved more. She needed more. Pearl's gaze fell upon the pitchfork leaning against the wall. A twisted smile crept across her face as a thought began to bloom, dark and intoxicating. She lifted it, testing its weight in her hands, the wooden handle smooth against her palm. If she was going to be free, she needed to be ruthless. The following morning, Pearl awoke to the sound of the rooster crowing, a shrill and insistent alarm that shattered the fragile peace of dawn. She dressed quickly, her movements careful so as not to wake Ruth, who was still snoring softly in the next room. Clutching her stolen coin purse, Pearl slipped out the back door and into the cool morning mist. The path to town was a winding one, lined with tall, skeletal trees that seemed to reach for her with bony fingers. Her heart raced as she imagined the stage, the warm glow of the spotlight washing over her. She pictured herself twirling, dancing, captivating the crowd with every move. But as she reached the outskirts of town, a sickly dread began to gnaw at her stomach. The barn she had so often fantasized about performing in stood tall in the distance, its silhouette like a skeletal hand against the blood-red sky. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, her pulse quickening as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. A dozen faces turned to her, each one as desperate as her own. Pearl straightened her shoulders, her confidence waning as the whispers of her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You're nothing, girl. You'll never make it." When it was finally her turn, she took to the makeshift stage, her heart pounding. The judges were a trio of men with tired eyes and sharp frowns, their expressions a mix of boredom and contempt. She began to dance, her feet moving in frantic patterns, her arms twisting and turning like the wings of a dying bird. She could feel the eyes on her, the weight of their silent judgment pressing down like a vice. But as she spun, something inside her broke free. The fear, the doubt, the years of loneliness, it all poured out in her movements, transforming her dance into a violent, primal expression. The judges' expressions shifted, their eyes widening, but it was not admiration that she saw. It was horror. Pearl's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled to a stop, her vision blurring. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Then one of the judges, a gaunt man with a moustache, spoke. "Thank you, miss, that will be all." Pearl's heart dropped into a black abyss. "But wait, I can do it again," she pleaded, her voice rising in desperation. "I just need another chance." "Leave," the judge snapped, turning away as if she were nothing more than a nuisance. Tears stung her eyes as she stumbled out of the barn, her dreams crushed beneath the weight of their indifference. She had given them everything, and still, it was not enough. The world had no place for her. But rage, hot and blinding, filled the hollow space in her chest. She would not go back to the farm, to the life of drudgery and misery that awaited her. She would make them see. She would make them all pay. The barn was nearly empty when Pearl returned that night. The judges were gathered around a small fire, their laughter echoing in the darkness. They didn't notice her until it was too late. Pearl moved like a spectre, her bare feet silent on the dusty ground. She raised the pitchfork, her hands steady, her eyes cold. The first judge didn't even have time to scream before she drove the tines through his throat, the wet sound of punctured flesh filling the air. The others scrambled to their feet, but Pearl was faster, fueled by a madness that had been building inside her for years. Blood sprayed in an arc, painting the walls in dark streaks. The final judge begged for mercy, his eyes wide with terror, but Pearl's heart was a block of ice. She plunged the pitchfork into his chest, twisting it until the light in his eyes faded. Breathless and covered in blood, Pearl stood among the corpses, her chest heaving. She smiled, a wild, triumphant grin that split her face. At last, she was the star of her own story, surrounded by an audience that would never leave her. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the scent of decay. The crimson sky had deepened to black, the stars above blinking like the eyes of distant spectators. Pearl stared up at them, her heart singing with a dark, twisted joy. For once in her life, she felt truly seen.
The worn frame. Kay had always hated returning to the old house. It stood at the end of a gravel road, hidden behind twisted oaks that seemed to grow more gnarled with each passing year. The windows were dark, like eyes sunken deep into a skull, watching her with the silent judgment of forgotten memories. But this time she had no choice. Her mother was missing, and no one else could stomach going in. Sam, her daughter, was at her side, shifting nervously as they stood at the foot of the porch steps. The air was thick, the scent of wet leaves and mold creeping into their nostrils. "Are you sure she's not at the store or something?" Sam asked, her voice tight with the kind of hope only youth could muster. Kay shook her head. Edna's neighbour had already called. She hadn't been seen for days, and when the local police had done a welfare check, they'd found nothing but an empty house. No sign of a struggle, no note. Just silence. They stepped inside, greeted by the familiar musty odour of dust and damp wood. The house was dimly lit, the afternoon sun unable to pierce through the thick curtains that Edna always insisted on keeping drawn. Kay flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulbs must have burned out. Kay sighed and turned to Sam. "We'll have to check the fuse box later. Let's just find something that gives us a clue." Sam nodded, the anxiety flickering in her eyes, and they split up. Kay moved toward the kitchen, while Sam made her way up the creaking staircase, her footsteps echoing through the hollow house. The kitchen was just as Kay remembered, every surface cluttered with mismatched ceramic figurines, old grocery lists, and unopened letters. Everything was exactly as her mother had left it. The only thing out of place was a mug, half filled with murky water, sitting in the middle of the table. Kay frowned, reaching out to pick it up, but a chill ran through her as her fingers brushed its handle. The water rippled, though she hadn't moved it. Upstairs, Sam paused outside her grandmother's bedroom door. The air was colder here, the kind of chill that seemed to seep straight into the bone. She pushed the door open, revealing a space both familiar and strange. The bed was neatly made, but the wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips, revealing a black, wet rot beneath. It hadn't been like that the last time she visited. On the nightstand was Edna's favorite photo, her, Kay, and Sam all smiling in a summer garden, the edges now warped and discolored. Sam reached for it, but as her fingers brushed the frame, the house seemed to exhale, a low, groaning creak that made her pull back. "Mum!" she called out, but her voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Meanwhile, Kay moved to the living room, where the air felt heavier, like wading through molasses. The once warm space was cloaked in shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. She paused at the threshold, her breath catching as a sound, a soft, irregular tapping, came from the wall beside her. A sickly smell hit her like a wave, the stench of rot and decay that made her stomach turn. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying not to retch, but something drew her closer to the wall, something almost magnetic. She reached out, touching the peeling wallpaper, and it crumbled under her fingers, revealing patches of dark mold spreading beneath. It pulsed, like something alive. "Sam!" she called, her voice strained. There was no answer. Upstairs, Sam was frozen in front of the closet door in Edna's room. It had been left ajar, and she could see something inside, a darkness that seemed thicker than it had any right to be. The floor creaked behind her, and she spun around expecting her mother, but there was no one there, only the deepening shadows. "Mum, this isn't funny," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper, but the house did not respond, only groaned in that strange, almost human way, like it was settling itself for the night. She turned back to the closet, her heart hammering, and pulled the door fully open. Inside was an old, moth-eaten coat that smelled faintly of her grandmother's perfume. But behind it, pressed against the back wall, was something that made her blood run cold. Scratches, deep gouges in the wood, like someone, or something, had been desperately trying to claw its way out. Downstairs, Kay was running her fingers along the wall, trying to find the source of the tapping, when her hand brushed against something cold and wet. She jerked back, staring at her fingertips, which were now smeared with a dark, oily substance. The scent of decay grew stronger, almost overpowering her. That's when she saw it, a dark shape moving just beyond her field of vision. It was like a flicker, something skittering just at the edge of her awareness. She turned sharply, but there was nothing there, only the same old house with its faded wallpaper and dusty furniture. "Sam!" she shouted, panic rising in her chest. The sound of hurried footsteps came from above, and Sam appeared at the top of the staircase, her face pale. "Mum, I found something." Before she could finish, the lights flickered on, bathing the house in a sickly yellow glow, but the relief was short-lived. The light revealed what they had missed in the dark. Black stains spreading across the ceiling like spiderwebs, and the walls seemed to sag inward, as if the house itself was collapsing from within. And then, a new sound, the shuffle of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. From the far end of the hallway, Kay could see a figure emerging from the darkness. It was Edna, or at least it looked like her. She was hunched, her skin stretched tight over her bones, her eyes sunken pits of shadow. She moved with an unnatural gait, her limbs jerking with each step. "Mum?" Kay's voice was barely more than a whisper. Edna's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Instead, a low, guttural croak filled the air, as if something was trying to speak through her. Sam began to back away, her heart pounding in her throat. But Kay stepped forward, unable to help herself. "Mum, it's me. We've been looking for you." Edna's eyes, black and hollow, locked onto her. And then, with a sudden, jerky motion, she lunged forward. Her hands, cold and clammy, latched onto Kay's wrists with a strength that made her cry out. "The house," Edna rasped, her voice like the scrape of nails on a chalkboard. "It's in the house." Kay struggled, but the grip was unrelenting, pulling her closer. The smell of rot and decay was overwhelming, the black mold on the walls seeming to pulse in time with Edna's ragged breaths. Sam screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the house as if it were absorbing the very air around them. And then, as quickly as it began, it stopped. Edna's hands released Kay, and she crumpled to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. The house groaned once more, settling back into its suffocating silence. Kay and Sam stood there, trembling, the echo of Edna's words hanging in the air. The house was in her, and she was in the house. They had come looking for Edna, but what they had found was something much older, something that wore her face like a mask. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the twisted oaks that surrounded the house. And somewhere deep within its walls, the tapping began again.
The night we stayed. The rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs below was the only sound in the air as they arrived. The isolated house stood like a sentinel over the ocean, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the fading orange glow of the sunset. For a moment, it was all so perfect. A weekend retreat, just the four of them. A chance to unwind and forget their lives back in the city. Charlie killed the engine of his SUV and turned to the others, grinning. "See? I told you it'd be worth the drive." Michelle, his wife, leaned forward from the back seat, her eyes widening as she took in the sight. "Wow, it's even better than the photos." Next to her, Mina offered a tight smile. "Yeah, it's perfect," she said, though the subtle tension in her voice suggested otherwise. Josh, her boyfriend, said nothing, staring out at the house with an unreadable expression. He was always quiet around Charlie, a lingering bitterness that never quite resolved. They unpacked their bags and settled into the house, a sleek modern structure that felt almost too perfect, like something designed for a magazine spread rather than human occupants. There were no neighbours in sight, just the endless expanse of the ocean and the dense forest behind them. Mina noticed the security cameras mounted at the corners of the house, their small red lights blinking steadily. "Guess the owners don't trust renters much," she remarked as she passed the living room window. "Can't blame them," Charlie said, chuckling. "People get wild in places like this." He threw her a wink, but it came off as forced. Mina looked away, her mind drifting back to the last time they had seen each other alone, the conversation they swore never to mention. The first night was smooth, filled with laughter and shared bottles of wine. But even as they joked and reminisced, there was an unspoken tension beneath it all. Michelle kept her eyes on Charlie a bit too long, her smile faltering whenever he and Mina exchanged glances. Josh downed drink after drink, his silent fury simmering whenever Charlie tried to engage him in conversation. It was all surface-level civility, a fragile facade that threatened to crack at any moment. The next morning, Mina woke up early, the house still silent. She stepped outside, hoping to clear her head with the salty air, but her attention was drawn to something odd. In the flower bed beneath the living room windows, she found a small blackened piece of fabric. It looked like part of a glove, charred and frayed at the edges, She brushed it off as garbage, maybe something left by the previous renters, but a chill ran down her spine as she tossed it into the trash bin. As the day wore on, the sense of unease only deepened. Michelle had found a door in the basement that was locked tight, no matter how hard she tried to turn the knob. Charlie joked about it being the forbidden room, but something in the pit of her stomach twisted at the thought of what might be behind it. That evening, after another awkward dinner, they decided to relax in the hot tub on the deck. The mist from the water mingled with the cool night air, and for a while, it seemed like everything was normal again. But then Mina noticed something. Just for a second, in the reflection of the windows, she thought she saw a figure standing in the shadows beyond the trees. "Did you see that?" she whispered to Josh, who was sitting next to her. "See what?" he asked, his voice slurred from too much whiskey. But when she looked again, the figure was gone. A trick of the light, she told herself. The alcohol was playing tricks on her mind. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Later that night, Mina lay awake staring at the ceiling. She was certain she heard footsteps above them, slow and deliberate. She nudged Josh, but he was already snoring heavily. She told herself it was nothing, just the house settling or an animal on the roof. But as the minutes dragged on, the footsteps grew louder, and Mina's heart began to race. The next morning, things took a darker turn. Josh found a hidden camera in one of the smoke detectors. It was small, almost imperceptible, but there it was, blinking red in the dim light. Panic rippled through the group. "What the hell is this?" Josh demanded, holding the camera up for the others to see. "Maybe it's just security," Charlie suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Security, my ass," Josh spat, his eyes blazing. "Someone's been watching us." A tense argument erupted. Michelle accused Charlie of knowing about the cameras all along, her voice breaking as she confronted him. Mina tried to play peacemaker, but her eyes kept darting to the windows, half expecting to see that figure again. By the afternoon, paranoia had fully set in. Josh took the lead, ripping apart light fixtures, air vents, and appliances in a desperate search for more hidden cameras. But with each hour that passed, the atmosphere in the house grew more claustrophobic, the sense of being watched more oppressive. They decided to leave the next morning, but as night fell, a thick fog rolled in, enveloping the house and cutting off their view of the surrounding forest. That's when they heard the noise, a low rhythmic scraping coming from the basement. It was a sound that sent a shiver through their spines, like nails dragging against a concrete floor. They all froze, exchanging fearful glances. Without a word, Josh grabbed a flashlight, and the four of them descended into the darkness together. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with mildew and something else, something metallic. The scraping noise had stopped, leaving them in an oppressive silence. As they moved deeper into the basement, the flashlight beam danced over old dust-covered furniture and piles of boxes. But then, at the far end of the room, they saw it. The locked door Michelle had found earlier, now slightly ajar. A cold gust of air flowed through the gap, carrying with it a faint stench of decay. Charlie pushed the door open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. At first, it looked empty, but as they stepped inside, Mina's foot connected with something soft. She screamed as she realized what it was. A body, twisted and partially decomposed, its face contorted in a final scream. Before they could react, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening crash. The light flickered, and in the brief darkness, they heard that scraping sound again, this time much closer. A sudden, sharp breath on the back of Mina's neck sent her reeling. In the faint light, she caught a glimpse of a figure, its face obscured, eyes glinting with malice. Chaos erupted. They pounded on the door, screamed for help, but it was as if the house had swallowed them whole. The figure moved closer, its breath wheezing, the sound of metals scraping against the floor growing louder. Michelle's screams were abruptly cut off, followed by the sickening crunch of bone. In the end, it was just Mina and the darkness, She pressed herself into the corner, eyes wide, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The figure stood before her, tilting its head, as if savouring her fear. The last thing Mina heard was the low, rhythmic scraping, a sound she now realised wasn't metal, but bone on concrete, before the darkness took her. The Blood of Dredmoor. In the heart of the revitalised neighbourhood of Dredmoor Heights, the past lingered in the cracks of polished brownstones and the gaps between trendy cafes. The new residents liked to think they'd changed the area, that they'd smoothed over its rough edges. But beneath the surface, the history of blood, pain and betrayal ran deeper than the foundations of the chic boutiques and yoga studios that lined the streets. Kendra Moore had just moved into a refurbished loft, a pristine space with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows. She was drawn to Dredmoor Heights by its vibrant energy, its art scene, and the whispers of something darker that clung to the air like smoke. As a journalist for the city's indie newspaper, The City Eye, she had a nose for stories hidden in plain sight. One evening, while browsing the neighbourhood's archives at the local library, Kendra stumbled upon a yellowed, brittle file labelled The Butcher of Dredmoor. It detailed a series of grisly murders from the 1950s. The victims, all black men and women, found with their throats slit and strange symbols carved into their foreheads. The murders were attributed to a madman, a butcher named Elijah Graves, who was lynched by a furious mob. But before they ended his life, Graves supposedly cursed the very ground of Dredmoor, vowing that his spirit would return to feed on the blood of those who had betrayed him. Kendra's interest was piqued. The murders were officially unsolved, but there were whispers that the butcher had been wrongfully accused, that he was a scapegoat for crimes the city wanted to hide. The thought lingered in her mind, growing like a seed planted in fertile soil. She needed to know more, to dig deeper. She reached out to local historian Marcus Belton, an old man who had lived in Dredmoor Heights for nearly 80 years. His voice was a low, raspy whisper as he spoke of the curse over a cup of coffee in a dimly lit cafe. Elijah Graves, he said, leaning closer, wasn't just some crazed killer. He was a butcher, yes, but he wasn't the one doing the killings. They blamed him because he knew too much, knew about the corruption in the city, and they lynched him to keep him quiet. Belton's eyes were wild, gleaming with the fervour of a man who had carried the burden of knowledge for far too long. But you see, they didn't stop him. Not really. The curse he spoke, it's real. They say he still walks these streets. If you call on him, if you seek the truth, he'll find you. Kendra scoffed it off as just another ghost story. But that night, alone in her loft, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows outside her windows were watching her. The words from the file and Belton's warnings buzzed in her mind like angry hornets. What if it was true? In the days that followed, Kendra's obsession grew. She found herself sketching symbols she had seen in the old file, their jagged lines invading her dreams. She wrote feverishly, desperate to uncover the truth. The modern-day Dredmoor Heights was painted with a glossy coat, but the deeper she dug, the more she found rot beneath. Late one night, while staring into her bathroom mirror, she muttered his name. She didn't know why she did it. Perhaps it was the exhaustion, the wine, or the dark urge to see if the curse was real. Elijah Graves, she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. She repeated it 5 times, half expecting nothing, half expecting something. For a moment there was only silence. Then a cold draft whispered through the room, making the hair on her arms stand on end. The mirror began to fog up, though she hadn't turned on the hot water. A shape took form behind her reflection, tall, gaunt, with eyes that burned like dying embers. She spun around, but the bathroom was empty. The air felt heavy, charged with something ancient and malevolent. Kendra laughed nervously, brushing it off as her imagination playing tricks on her. But when she turned back to the mirror, the words, "Blood calls for blood," were scrawled across the glass in dripping crimson letters. From that moment, Kendra's life unraveled. She saw him in fleeting glimpses, a shadow at the end of a hallway, a tall figure in the corner of her eye, and each time, the air grew colder, the world around her dimming as though his presence sucked the light from the room. Her apartment, once her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Desperate, she returned to Marcus Belton, but when she arrived at his apartment, she found him dead. His body was splayed grotesquely across his study, throat slit, the same symbols carved into his forehead. The police ruled it a break-in gone wrong, but Kendra knew the truth. Elijah Graves had returned, just as Belton had warned. The curse was real and it was hungry. Determined to end it, Kendra followed the trail of symbols to the old butcher shop where Elijah had once worked. It was now a crumbling, abandoned husk at the edge of Dredmoor Heights, a forgotten relic amidst the shiny new developments. The air inside was thick with decay, the scent of rot mingling with the distant echoes of screams. In the basement, she found an altar, blackened with old blood, and there in the centre was a mirror. As Kendra approached, the temperature dropped, and she could see her breath misting in the air. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and from its depths Elijah emerged. His eyes were hollow pits, his hands stained with the blood of those who had dared summon him. "Blood calls for blood," he rasped, his voice like the scrape of a blade on bone. Kendra tried to run, but the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, the walls closing in like the jaws of a great beast. "Elijah!" she cried. "I only wanted to uncover the truth." "Truth?" he hissed, tilting his head like a curious predator. "The truth is, the debt must be paid." He raised his knife, its edge gleaming in the dim light, and Kendra's scream was swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, her body was found by the construction workers breaking ground on a new high-rise. Her throat had been slit, and the symbols, the same symbols from the old murders, were carved into her forehead. The police ruled it as another random act of violence in the city. But the old-timers, those who remembered the stories of the butcher, knew better. At Dredmoor Heights was changing, but the blood that had soaked its soil had not been forgotten. Elijah Graves would return as long as the city fed him, and as long as there were those foolish enough to seek him, he would continue to answer the call. For in Dredmoor, the past was never truly buried.
The Beneath. Tess pulled up to the house, her headlights slicing through the darkness of the forgotten Detroit neighborhood. The street was a graveyard of abandoned, graffiti-laden homes, their windows shattered, doors hanging ajar like broken mouths. The house she had booked stood out, surprisingly well kept, its white paint glistening under the rain-soaked sky. She checked her phone again. The address matched. With a quick, nervous breath, Tess grabbed her overnight bag and hurried to the porch. She tried the lockbox code, once, twice, 3 times, but it wouldn't open. Her frustration mounting, she tapped her phone, scrolling through her email to check the instructions again. A noise behind her made her whip around. Nothing, just the wind rustling through the desolate trees. Then she noticed it, the soft glow of a light coming from inside the house. Someone was already there. Tess hesitated but knocked. The door opened, revealing a tall man with tousled hair and a bewildered expression. He was dressed casually, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd been traveling for hours. Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying a hesitant politeness. "I'm Tess," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I booked this place on Airbnb." Keith frowned and pulled out his phone. "No way, I booked it too." They stood there for a moment, the rain drumming on the porch roof, each trying to make sense of the situation. Finally, Keith stepped aside. "You might as well come in while we figure this out." Tess hesitated, but then stepped into the warmth of the house, grateful to escape the cold drizzle outside. Keith showed her his booking confirmation, and Tess confirmed hers in return. It was clear they were both telling the truth. After a few awkward minutes of trying to reach the rental agency without success, Tess weighed her options. She could drive back into the rain and try to find a last-minute hotel, or she could stay. Keith seemed harmless enough, and he offered to sleep on the couch so she could have the bedroom. Reluctantly, Tess agreed, telling herself it was just for one night. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak as the old wood settled. Tess lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind unable to rest. Something about the house felt wrong. It wasn't the worn furniture or the faded rugs, it was something deeper, something that gnawed at her nerves. A sound broke the silence, a soft thud from below. Tess bolted upright, her breath caught in her throat. Listening intently, she waited, but the noise didn't repeat. It's probably just Keith moving around, she told herself, yet the unease lingered, like a hand brushing lightly against the back of her neck. Finally, unable to sleep, Tess crept out of the room. The dim light from the living room cast long shadows on the walls as she tiptoed down the hallway. Keith was fast asleep on the couch, his form unmoving. Then she heard it again, a low, muffled sound, almost like a whimper. But it was coming from beneath the floorboards. Heart pounding, Tess followed the noise to a door in the kitchen she hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, revealing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. She glanced back at Keith, who hadn't stirred. Against her better judgment, she descended. The basement was musty and cold, the air thick with a sour smell that stung her nostrils. Old cardboard boxes and rusted tools cluttered the space, but there was nothing that could explain the noises. As she turned to head back upstairs, her foot caught on something, a rope embedded in the wall. Curiosity overrode her fear. Tess gave it a tentative tug, and the wall shifted, revealing a narrow passageway behind it. The stench grew stronger, a nauseating blend of decay and damp earth. She hesitated, her instincts screaming to turn back, but she pressed on, pulling out her phone to use its flashlight. The tunnel stretched into the darkness, its walls lined with crumbling brick. The deeper she went, the more her dread grew, a tightening knot in her stomach. The air was thick, suffocating, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. Finally, she reached a metal door at the end of the tunnel. It was slightly ajar, light spilling through the crack. With trembling hands, Tess pushed it open. Inside was a small concrete room, bare except for a stained mattress on the floor and a camcorder mounted on a tripod. The walls were smeared with dark stains that she desperately hoped weren't blood. Panic surged through her, and she turned to flee, but the door slammed shut behind her. A figure loomed in the darkness, a gaunt, disheveled man with wild eyes and a grin that made Tess's blood run cold. "Welcome," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "I've been waiting." Tess's scream echoed down the labyrinth of tunnels as she bolted past the man, her heart pounding like a jackhammer. She reached the main tunnel, only to find it was no longer a straight path, but a twisting maze of branching corridors. She ran blindly, the flickering light of her phone casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Behind her, the man's footsteps were slow and deliberate, a predator savoring the chase. Suddenly, Tess stumbled into a cavernous space that looked like an underground chapel. The ceiling arched high above, supported by stone pillars, and strange symbols were scrawled in blood on the walls. In the center was a pit from which emanated an unnatural, sickly green glow. She could hear whispers, like distant voices crying out in agony. Something was moving in the pit, something that shouldn't exist. It was a mass of limbs, eyes and mouths, all writhing together in a grotesque dance. The stench was unbearable, a miasma of rotting meat and burnt hair. Tess's mind rebelled at the sight, her vision swimming. A hand grabbed her shoulder, jerking her back to reality. She spun around, her phone slipping from her grasp. It was Keith. "What are you doing down here?" he hissed, his face twisted with panic. "We need to go, now!" But it was too late. The thing in the pit stirred, rising like a nightmare birthed from the depths. Its many eyes focused on them, and a guttural roar filled the chamber, vibrating through Tess's bones. Without a second thought, Keith grabbed her wrist and pulled her down a side passage, the monstrous howls chasing them through the darkness. They ran through the twisting corridors, the walls seeming to pulse around them. Tess could feel the thing behind them, its putrid breath on her neck. The tunnel twisted and turned, reality itself seeming to bend. Then they burst into another room, a dead end. Keith turned, his eyes wide with terror. "There's no way out," he whispered. "It's—" The wall behind him exploded, and the creature burst through, its tendrils wrapping around Keith with terrifying speed. He screamed as it dragged him toward the gaping maw that had opened in its center. Tess watched, frozen, as Keith was pulled apart, his blood splattering the walls. Something snapped inside her. She turned and ran, diving into a narrow crevice, just as the monster lunged for her. Crawling, clawing her way through the tight space, she emerged into the basement. She bolted up the stairs, her breath ragged. As she reached the kitchen, she heard it. The thing was coming up behind her. Without looking back, she threw herself out the front door and into the rain. The house loomed behind her, its dark windows like empty eyes watching her escape. The flesh that binds. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic as the electrocardiogram beeped steadily in the dimly lit room. Dr. Bernard Hayes stared at the monitor, his eyes narrowing. The patient on the table, restrained at the wrists and ankles, thrashed violently against the leather straps. Sweat dripped from the doctor's brow as he turned to his assistant. "We're losing control," he muttered. "Increase the dosage." The assistant nodded, injecting a clear fluid into the IV line. The patient let out an inhuman scream, their back arching unnaturally, eyes rolling back into their skull. Dr. Hayes watched with a mix of awe and dread. They had come too far to turn back now. The project was their last hope, the culmination of years of unethical research. As the screams subsided and the patient went limp, the doctor sighed in relief. But beneath the surface, something stirred. The monitor flickered erratically, and a deep, guttural voice crackled through the intercom. "You can't keep me locked away forever." The voice was not the patient's, but something else entirely. The assistant gasped, backing away, but Dr. Hayes only tightened his jaw. "It's getting stronger," he said. "We need more restraints." The lights in the room flickered, and then everything went dark. 20 years later. Harper West sat bolt upright in bed, gasping for air. The nightmare was vivid, more so than any she had experienced before. In it, she was in a dimly lit room, surrounded by shadowy figures with scalpel-like fingers. They were slicing into flesh, peeling it back, while a voice whispered her name over and over. Shaking off the remnants of sleep, she glanced at her clock. 3:33 a.m., the witching hour. Her heart still pounding, she climbed out of bed and made her way to the bathroom. As she splashed cold water on her face, she caught a glimpse of something behind her in the mirror, a flicker of movement, like a figure standing just out of sight. She spun around, but the bathroom was empty. Harper closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe deeply. "It's just a dream," she whispered to herself. "Just a dream." But deep down, she knew it was more than that. For weeks now, the nightmares had been getting worse. It had all started after she moved into her new apartment, a quaint old building on the outskirts of town. At first, she thought it was just the stress of the move, but the visions were becoming disturbingly real. As she turned to leave the bathroom, her phone buzzed on the counter. A message notification glowed on the screen. "Did you see it too?" The message was from an unknown number. Harper's hands shook as she stared at it. She deleted the message, chalking it up to a prank. But as she lay back down in bed, sleep did not come. The whispers she heard in the silence were no longer confined to her dreams. The next morning, Harper tried to go about her day as usual. She worked at a small bookstore downtown, surrounded by the comforting smell of old paper and leather bindings. But today, the familiarity brought no comfort. As she shelved a stack of novels, her vision blurred and she was hit with a sudden, overwhelming headache. The world around her twisted and darkened. She was no longer in the bookstore, but in a dimly lit hallway. The walls were slick with something wet and foul-smelling, and the air was heavy with rot. Harper tried to scream, but no sound came out. A shadow darted past her peripheral vision, and she turned to see a figure crawling toward her, its body twisted and contorted, the sound of cracking bones filling the air. Her vision snapped back to reality, and she found herself on the floor of the bookstore, her co-worker Clara kneeling beside her, concern etched on her face. "Harper, are you okay? You just collapsed." Harper nodded weakly, but inside she was screaming. What the hell was happening to her? That night, as she lay in bed, Harper's mind raced. The visions were getting worse, and she was terrified of what might happen if they continued. She needed answers. Desperate, she began to dig through her past, scouring old family records and medical files. What she discovered only deepened her dread. Her birth records were sealed, and there were no medical records from her early childhood. It was as if her life before the age of 6 had been erased. Her adoptive parents, who had passed away years ago, never spoke of her origins, and now she understood why. Determined to uncover the truth, Harper made her way to the hospital where she was born, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain her condition. The hospital was old, a relic of the past with flickering lights and creaking floors. As she searched the archives, she stumbled upon a dusty folder labeled with her birth name. Inside, she found a series of disturbing reports. "Patient exhibits signs of advanced dissociative behavior," one of the doctors had written. "Subject appears to have an unidentified entity residing within." The final page was a photograph of an ultrasound, 2 shapes within her mother's womb. One was clearly human, but the other, twisted, malformed. As Harper stared at the photograph, a wave of nausea hit her, and the lights in the room flickered violently. The air grew cold, and a familiar voice echoed in her mind. "I've been waiting for you, sister." The world spun around her, and she found herself in a different room, a surgical theatre with blinding lights overhead. Figures in white coats surrounded her, their faces obscured by surgical masks. The restraints on her wrists and ankles dug into her flesh, and she realized, with a sickening dread, that she was strapped to an operating table. The sound of surgical instruments clinking together sent a chill down her spine. And then she saw him. A figure emerged from the shadows, his body grotesque and twisted, skin pulled tight over jutting bones. His eyes were black pits, devoid of humanity. "Gabriel," she whispered, though she didn't know where the name came from. The figure smiled, revealing teeth that were more like jagged shards of glass. "No, not Gabriel," he hissed. "We were never truly separated." Harper's scream echoed in the sterile room as she realized the truth. The nightmares, the visions, they were memories. She hadn't been having hallucinations, she had been seeing through his eyes. The figure lunged forward, and she felt an agonizing pain rip through her spine. She could feel him there, inside her, like a parasite that had been dormant, but was now reawakening. She understood then that they were bound together, 2 souls trapped in one body, and he was taking control. The police found Harper in her apartment the next morning, covered in blood. The bodies of her neighbors lay strewn across the hallway, their faces frozen in terror. She was sitting in the corner, whispering to herself, her eyes vacant. "I'm sorry," she murmured as they led her away in handcuffs. "I couldn't stop him." But as they drove her to the station, a cruel smile played at the corners of her lips. The officers didn't notice her eyes flash black for a brief moment. In the depths of her mind, Harper screamed, but the thing that wore her face only laughed. "We are one now," it whispered, "and there's nothing you can do to stop me."
Body count swap. "Happy freaking Friday," shouted Molly, waving her pom-poms in the air. The pep rally was in full swing, and the gymnasium echoed with cheers as the football team marched onto the court. Molly was riding high. She had just aced her history exam. secured a date with the new quarterback, and was basically feeling like the queen of Maplewood High. But while the rest of the school was celebrating, Parker was not having a great day. He was stuck in detention, scribbling doodles on his worn-out Converse sneakers, grumbling about how unfair it was that he got caught sneaking his vape in the bathroom while everyone else got away with murder. Well, figuratively speaking. As the clock ticked towards the weekend, the town of Maplewood was blissfully unaware that their peaceful bubble was about to pop. Because deep in the forest, hidden in the shadows, something, or rather someone, was preparing for another spree. Frank, the butcher. Mulgrave was infamous in these parts. 6'4" with shoulders like a linebacker, Frank was not just your typical serial killer. He had a unique way of selecting his victims. He only hunted those who were blissfully unaware of their surroundings, like cheerleaders too busy posing for selfies or jocks who thought they were invincible. Tonight, however, Frank was about to get a little taste of irony. 6:45 p.m. outside Maplewood High School. Molly and her best friend Jessie giggled as they stumbled out of the gym, still hyped up on adrenaline and the remnants of their Starbucks lattes. The parking lot was mostly empty by now, except for a few stragglers. "Let's hit up Pete's Pizza, I'm craving a slice," Jessie suggested, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "You read my mind, girl," Molly agreed, unlocking her car. But as they climbed in, they didn't notice the pair of eyes watching them from the bushes, a gleaming knife catching the last rays of the sun. 7 p.m, the forest. Frank was on the prowl, his heavy boots crunching leaves underfoot. He had been stalking Molly for a week now. She was everything he despised about teenagers: loud, popular, and utterly self-absorbed. But as he raised his knife, preparing for his favourite part of the hunt, something strange happened. A flash of light, brighter than a dozen fireworks, exploded between Frank and Molly. The air crackled with static, and the ground beneath them seemed to ripple. Both of them screamed, their voices blending into one, and in an instant everything went black. 7:05 p.m, Molly's car. Molly opened her eyes, gasping, but something was wrong. Instead of the soft leather of her car seat, she felt cold, hard ground beneath her, and she was surrounded by darkness. She reached up to touch her face, but her hands were wrong. They were massive, rough, covered in scars. "What the hell?" she muttered, only to freeze at the sound of her voice, a deep guttural growl that sent shivers down her spine. At the same time, Frank, now in the driver's seat of Molly's car, blinked in confusion, staring at his hands. They were small, manicured, with bright pink nails. He let out a high-pitched scream, and Jessie whipped around in her seat. "Molly, what's wrong?" Jessie asked, eyes wide with concern. Frank, now in Molly's body, took a deep breath, a sinister grin spreading across his borrowed lips. This was going to be fun. 8:30 p.m, Pete's Pizza. Jessie was starting to worry. Ever since they arrived at Pete's, Molly had been acting off. She was eating pizza like she hadn't seen food in years, tearing into it with her bare hands, grease dripping down her chin. "So, any plans for the weekend?" Jessie asked, trying to make conversation. Frank, who was still getting used to Molly's petite body, gave her a wicked smile. "Oh, you have no idea, Jess. I've got some killer plans." Meanwhile, Molly, trapped in Frank's hulking frame, was stumbling through the forest, trying to figure out where she was. Every muscle in her borrowed body ached, and she was horrified to realise that she was craving blood. No, I am not a psycho," she yelled into the darkness, but her new body seemed to disagree. 9:15 p.m, the town fair. Frank, now fully embracing the absurdity of his situation, decided to take Molly's body for a test drive. The town fair was packed, with colourful lights and laughter filling the air. As he moved through the crowd, he couldn't help but laugh to himself. He had spent years hiding in the shadows, but now, in the body of a bubbly cheerleader, he could walk among his victims without anyone suspecting a thing. Spotting a group of boys near the Ferris wheel, Frank grinned. "Hey guys, want to play a game?" he purred, twirling a strand of Molly's hair around his finger. They had no idea that the cheerful girl batting her eyelashes at them was plotting their demise. 10 p.m. The abandoned cabin. Molly finally made it out of the woods, panting heavily. She had never been so happy to see civilization, even if it was just a run-down cabin on the outskirts of town. Inside, she found a dusty mirror and screamed. Frank's terrifying face stared back at her, eyes wild with panic. "Okay, Molly, think. How do you fix a freaky body swap?" she muttered, pacing the room. A sudden flash of memory hit her. It was the ancient dagger Frank had been holding. She had seen something like it in a Netflix show once. Maybe if I stab him with it again, it'll reverse whatever happened. With renewed determination, she sprinted toward the town fair. 10:30 p.m, the Ferris wheel. Frank was enjoying the chase. In Molly's body, he was practically invisible, able to blend into the crowd with ease. He had just finished cornering one of the boys when Molly, in Frank's body, burst onto the scene, gasping for breath. "Hey, psycho, over here!" she yelled. Frank turned, eyes narrowing as he saw his own towering form charging toward him. Well, if it isn't the guest of honor," he sneered. Molly didn't waste any time. She lunged forward, grabbing the dagger from Frank's waistband. But before she could stab him, Frank, now fully aware of what she was trying to do, used his new, nimble body to dodge out of the way. "Too slow, sweetie," he taunted, raising the knife he had stolen from a carnival booth. But Molly was done playing nice. She remembered the one advantage she had: brute strength. With a roar, she swung a massive fist, catching Frank in her own body, square in the jaw. The two of them struggled, a tangle of limbs and confusion, until finally Molly managed to plunge the dagger into Frank's side. A flash of light erupted between them, and for a second, everything seemed to freeze. 11 p.m. The aftermath. Molly opened her eyes to find herself back in her own body, the familiar weight of her cheerleading uniform bringing tears to her eyes. Frank, however, was not so lucky. He was trapped in his old body, bleeding out on the cold ground. "You ruined everything," he spat, clutching his wound. Molly just grinned. "Yeah, well, maybe next time you won't mess with a cheerleader who knows how to fight dirty." As the police sirens approached, Molly couldn't help but smile. It was one hell of a Freaky Friday, but hey, at least she survived.
Thank you for watching, and remember, the darkness awaits. Until our paths cross again, stay fearful and stay subscribed.